Welcome back, everybody. Really glad to have you here for another deep dive with us. This time, we're going to be taking a look at Franz Kafka's Amerika. And from the looks of the excerpts you sent over, it seems like you're particularly interested in the philosophical side of it all. You know, the themes like alienation and bureaucracy and identity and power and absurdity. So, yeah, those are some pretty heavy topics, but hopefully we can shed some light on them today and see what we can find.
It's amazing how Kafka can take these, seemingly simple situations and pack them with so much depth. Like, just look at Karl Rossmann arriving in New York. He's young and excited about starting a new life, full of optimism. But almost immediately, he starts to feel like an outsider, like he doesn't quite belong.
Yeah, and that scene with the stoker on the ship really jumped out at me. Karl tries to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Stand up for this guy who's being treated unfairly, but it coldly backfires. It's like he just doesn't get the social rules of this new world.
Exactly. The Stoker incident is such a great example of the alienation that runs throughout the whole novel. Karl has good intentions, but he ends up completely misunderstood. And it goes deeper than just a language barrier. It's this feeling of not belonging, of not understanding the rules of the game.
It's like when you start a new job, you're trying to fit into a new group of people and you just can't quite figure out those unspoken rules. You try to do something nice and it's met with awkward silence or, people just looking at you like you're from another planet.
Right. It's that feeling of being an outsider, of being subtly excluded from the inner circle. And Kafka captures that so well in Karl's early experiences in Amerika.
And it's not just a one-time thing. As we go through these excerpts, we see Karl constantly being pushed into these different roles: nephew, student, accused, worker, and each one comes with a whole new set of expectations that he struggles to live up to.
That's a really interesting point. It's like he's desperately searching for a place where he truly belongs, a stable identity. But he keeps getting defined by others, forced to conform to their expectations.
His uncle at first is super welcoming, gives him this luxurious life, but then just like that, he turns on him and accuses him of some wrongdoing. It's this sudden and dramatic shift in power and leaves Karl completely lost.
Put yourself in Karl's shoes. He's given this privileged position, but he doesn't know how to act. Everyone around him seems to know the rules of the game, how to navigate the social hierarchy, but he keeps messing up, breaking these unspoken codes without even realizing it.
And then he's thrown back into uncertainty, having to rely on the kindness of strangers who may or may not have his best interests in mind. It really makes you think about power and control, how easily our fortunes can change just based on the whims of others.
Absolutely. And this ties into the theme of bureaucracy, which is so central to Kafka's work. We see it in how Karl's uncle runs his business, in the rigid social structures he encounters, in the way he's constantly being judged and evaluated.
It's strange how even in America, this place that's supposed to be all about freedom and opportunity, Karl keeps running into these systems that seem designed to limit his choices to control his destiny.
Right. It's the paradox of the American dream. It promises so much, but it can also be incredibly restrictive, especially for those who don't quite fit the mold.
Which leads us to the question of identity. Who is Karl Rossmann, really? And how are all these experiences shaping his sense of self?
That's a question that Kafka seems to be exploring throughout the novel. Karl is constantly being defined by external forces, by the roles he's forced to play, by the judgments of others. He's trying to find his core identity, but it's like the world around him keeps trying to mold him into something he's not.
Like when he's given that new name, Negro, at the theater of Oklahoma, it's almost like they're stripping away his individuality, turning him into just another cog in the machine.
That's a powerful example. The name change is both absurd and deeply symbolic. It shows how power can be used to control and dehumanize people, to erase their sense of self.
It reminds us that even in a land of opportunity, the search for identity can be a really complicated and sometimes unsettling journey, especially for those who find themselves on the margins of society.
And that brings us to another important theme that runs through these excerpts: absurdity. Karl finds himself in these bizarre, illogical situations that seem to highlight the irrationality of the systems he encounters.
It's like Kafka is using humor, even if it's a dark kind of humor, to expose the flaws and contradictions of the modern world.
It's funny how even when Kafka's showing us these really absurd situations, there's still something about them that feels familiar. Like that scene where Karl gets caught up in this fight between two women and ends up being accused of stealing.
Oh yeah, I mean, the whole situation is pretty crazy, but the way Kafka describes it, the power dynamics, the misunderstandings, how Karl's just stuck in the middle of it all, it feels like something that could happen to anyone.
It definitely taps into that feeling we've all had of being judged unfairly. being blamed for something we didn't do, trying to explain ourselves, but nobody in authority wants to listen.
It's like that scene with the policeman later on. Carl's trying to tell his side of the story, but the policeman doesn't care. He's just focused on the fact that Carl doesn't have the right papers.
It's a perfect example of how bureaucratic systems can be so dehumanizing. They get so caught up in rules and regulations that they lose sight of individual circumstances.
And the thing is, even though these systems are supposed to be rational and objective, they often end up being totally arbitrary. It seems like who gets punished and who gets rewarded just comes down to luck or the whims of whoever's in charge.
Exactly. And that's where the absurdity really hits home. Kafka's showing us how the systems we create for order and stability can actually be completely irrational and unpredictable.
And he does it in this way that's both funny and unsettling. You find yourself laughing at how ridiculous it all is, but at the same time, there's this underlying anxiety, this awareness of how easily we could become victims of these systems.
You see this a lot in Carl's experiences at the Hotel Occidental. He's just trying to do his job, but he's constantly being sabotaged by the head waiter, who's this hilariously absurd character, obsessed with rules and regulations, but also prone to these outbursts of anger and random punishments.
He is trapped in a nightmare. No matter what he does, he can't seem to please the head waiter, and he's always on the verge of getting fired.
And I think this points to a deeper sense of alienation that goes beyond just feeling like a stranger in a new country. It's this feeling of being alienated from yourself, from your own sense of purpose and agency.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because even though Carl's surrounded by people, he's incredibly isolated. He's always longing for connection, but he can't seem to form any real relationships.
Yeah. And even those moments of connection, like his interactions with Therese, are brief and kind of sad. There's this feeling that real intimacy is almost impossible in this world that Kafka has created.
It makes you wonder if modern society, with its focus on individualism and competition, actually creates barriers between people. We're always interacting with others, but how often do we really connect on a deeper level?
That's a really deep question, and it's one that Kafka seems to be wrestling with throughout America. He's exploring how modern life can alienate us from ourselves, from each other, and from a sense of meaning and purpose.
And yet, for all the darkness and absurdity, there are these glimmers of hope, too. Like Carl's optimism, his belief that things will work out, that he'll find his place eventually.
That's an important point to remember. Even when things are at their worst, Carl never completely gives up on that possibility. He keeps searching, keeps driving, keeps hoping for a better future.
And that's what makes America so powerful and enduring, even though it's unfinished. It's a story about the struggles we all face, alienation, bureaucracy, the search for identity. But it's also a story about resilience, about the importance of never giving up hope, even when everything seems absurd.
Absolutely. And it's a story that feels particularly relevant today. We live in a world that's becoming increasingly complex and uncertain, a world where it's easy to feel lost and disconnected.
But just like Carl, we have to keep searching, keep questioning, keep trying to make sense of it all. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find our way through the labyrinth. So we left Carl at a real turning point.
Yeah.
Running away from the Hotel Occidental and heading into the unknown with Delamarche. It feels like he's leaving behind everything he knew and going deeper into this strained and absurd world Kafka's created.
It's interesting how Delamarche is both this chance for something new and a potential danger at the same time. He's obviously manipulative, but he's also the only one Carl can really turn to at this point. He's like this twisted version of the American dream where you have to give up who you are, maybe even your morals, to achieve success.
Yeah, and that idea really comes to a head when they get to the Nature Theater of Oklahoma, right? It's this massive, almost mythical place that seems to promise everything and nothing at the same time.
Absolutely. It's another way Kafka's commenting on society. The theater is like a mini version of America itself, with its huge scale and chaotic energy and this idea that you can reinvent yourself, but also these impersonal systems and arbitrary rules that you have to follow.
That whole recruitment process was so weird. It's like a bizarre job interview, with these long lines and pointless questions, and you're constantly being judged, but you don't even know what for.
It's Kafka showing us the absurdity of bureaucracy. You get stuck in this system where you're always trying to prove your worth, but the rules are unclear, and the whole thing just makes you feel like a number.
But even with all of that, Carl doesn't give up hope. He keeps going, keeps trying to figure out the system, hoping that somewhere in this crazy theater, he'll find a place where he belongs.
And that's where the theme of identity becomes really important again. Think about that moment when Carl is given that new name, Negro. It's jarring, right? It's like they're stripping away his past, his individuality.
Like the theater's trying to force him into a role to erase anything that makes him unique. And isn't that something a lot of immigrants experience? This pressure to fit in, to conform, to become someone different.
Exactly. And it makes you think about whether true belonging means giving up a part of yourself. Can you really find a place in a new society without losing who you are?
Kafka doesn't give us any easy answers, but he makes us think about these really tough questions, these anxieties that are so fundamental to the human experience. And I think that's what makes America, even though it's unfinished, so powerful and relatable.
Even though the novel ends with Carl's future uncertain, heading off to this vast unknown that is Oklahoma, I think there's still a sense of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, Carl will find what he's looking for.
Yeah, maybe that's the message Kafka wants us to take away, that even in a world that often feels absurd and alienating, we can't stop searching. We can't stop hoping. We have to keep believing that we can find our place.
Because in the end, it's the journey itself with all its ups and downs. It's moments of despair and moments of hope that shapes who we become.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Kafka's America. Hopefully this has given you some new ways to think about this amazing and thought-provoking book.
And we encourage you to keep exploring Kafka's work and maybe even your own life with a sense of curiosity and a willingness to see things in a new light.
You never know what you might find.